Remember, men, may your blades be swift and your death be glorious. And when you charge at the enemy, forget backwards compatibility. Think of your brothers in arms charging alongside you. Think of loved ones awaiting your return. Think of the exclusives. Think of PlayStation. Xbox. Who away, Xbox, man? Cut down every last one of those PlayStation fanboys. We're stronger than them, faster than them. We have some games. We have pride in our strength. And incredible deals on Game Pass. Man, shout! Xbox, PlayStation, Xbox, PlayStation, PlayStation. That, students, is a sensationalized version of events. A bit of Hollywood creeping in there, if you will. All big budget, mostly fictional. It's certainly eye-catching, but you're not here to learn about fiction, are you? Let me tell you how it really went down. Let me tell you about the Great Console War. In the beginning, there was the word, and that word was PlayStation. Well, the word was actually Atari and then Nintendo and then Sega, but forget them for now. The word for the moment was PlayStation, and you should all know the name by now. The gaming juggernaut is perhaps the most well-known console manufacturer in the 21st century. Their fame precedes them for good reason. Their consoles are home to some of the most iconic franchises in history. The brand selling over 460 million mainline consoles over their company's entire lifespan. Now, these consoles were released at different prices, but if we take all of those prices, find an average, and multiply it by the big number of sales here, as a very, very rough estimate, PlayStation could have anywhere from $10 to $18 billion worth of sales. These are the kind of numbers we're working with here, guys. And with the dawn of the new generation of these consoles, with the PS5's release, we see that the demand for one of these consoles is as high as ever. You see, there's a rather well publicized shortage of PlayStation 5s on the market at the moment. Look on shopping websites and you'll see that the console is pretty much sold out everywhere. As soon as a supplier requires more stock on their online sites, it's gone again. Hundreds or thousands of units gone in just a couple of minutes. People like PlayStation. But it wasn't always this way. Yes, there was a time where the words play and station being put together meant nothing to your average consumer. And these strange times first started to change in 1988. This was the year that Sony, PlayStation's parent company, rather curiously joined forces with the main gaming giants of that era, Nintendo. They aimed together to create a CD-ROM for Nintendo's fresh console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Part of this CD-ROM's technology was referred to at Sony as the PlayStation. Work continued on the system for 3 years until in June 1991, Nintendo, after a revenue split dispute and with a little behind the scenes work, broke the partnership the pair of companies had forged, ditching Sony and agreeing to use the same technology but with a different supplier, going instead to one of Sony's rivals. Sony's president at the time, Norio Oga, was not impressed. He was more than a little miffed, so much so that instantly after the partnership broke down, Oga turned to top Sony executive Ken Kutaragi and handed him one responsibility: create a console that could rival Nintendo's in response. Dismissing reconciliatory offers from Nintendo, Kutaragi pressed onwards with the development of the new console. However, being a crucial part in the deal with Nintendo breaking down, Kutaragi was shunned by his peers at Sony upon presenting the idea of a console that would utilize groundbreaking 3D graphics. In-house at Sony, there was heavy opposition to this idea, and even though Kutaragi had the backing of his president to continue development, the executive was forced out of the company's HQ and sent to another branch of Sony's technological empire, Sony Music, away from the home base but luckily also away from the disapproving gaze of the onlooking detractors. Here, Kutaragi worked with some of the top brass at Sony Music to establish a whole new section to the company, Sony Computer Entertainment Incorporated. The new division attracted a widespread range of talent and set to work on their very first project, the original PlayStation. Built with similar CD-ROM based technology from the foregone partnership, this system, capable of 3D graphics, drew in major developers from all over. This technology being cheaper to develop for and easier to use than the cartridge-based system rivals Nintendo had made popular. The momentum was building, and as the years went on, Kutaragi must have felt he was onto something special. And then December 3rd, 1994 arrived. The console had been unleashed onto the Japanese consumer base as the PlayStation employees watched on with bated breath. Would the Japanese public buy it? Well, as it turns out, they would. Why? The PlayStation had a few things going for it. 1. Hype. New features teased, including the 3D aspect of the gameplay, had the public craving to get their hands on this console. 2. It was released just in time for the holidays, a major sales window games companies always hope to make the most of. And thirdly, the price point. For what the PlayStation gave you, the price was insanely low, lower than that of the alternative consoles of that era, like the Sega Saturn, with which they would have a short-lived rivalry within their home nation. The queues piled up with customers. The console would sell 100,000 in its first day on sale in Japan. This would extend to 2 million after 6 months. However, as was the case with many consoles from this early era of gaming, the original PlayStation would not yet release to the Western, US and European markets until late 1995, and while most in the West waited for that Western release date, some took the matter into their own hands, paying a premium price to have the Japanese version of the console shipped directly to their door. But for the rest of us, the American and European release dates were coming, Sony first unveiling the console to the Western market via a presentation at what would go on to be the highly respected and well-recognized American gaming trading event, E3, in May 1995. A small recap, E3 is a major event for gaming where companies and developers get up on stage to show off their shiny new project to the consumer and to their shareholders. I want you to remember E3 for me. The event will continue to be a major battlefield for the console going forward. Competitor the Sega Saturn was also at this E3 and had announced that their price point for their console would be $399. Sony and PlayStation responded, calling up their head of development Steve Race, who simply said $299 before leaving the stage to a raucous applause. Michael Jackson also made an appearance on Sony's stage, but it was the $100 price gap in PlayStation's favour, not Michael Jackson, that would be vital and would prove insurmountable to their competitors. Within 2 days on the American market, the PlayStation had outsold the Sega Saturn despite the latter having a 5-month head start, and from there it spiraled into wave after wave of success and sales for Sony and indeed PlayStation. Some called the battle with Sega a war. However, what it turned out to be was a massacre. The Sony PlayStation had outsold the Sega Saturn across the world in every area except Japan, where the pair were relatively neck and neck. Nevertheless, the PlayStation, through clever marketing, brute force pricing, and sheer frustration at a failed deal, had carved their way into the business world of gaming. And they had the momentum, and there were no signs of them slowing down. Behind the scenes work began right after the PlayStation's release in 1994. Sony were determined to release a successor. Outwardly to the public, nothing was being made. A PlayStation 2 wasn't coming anytime soon. It was the worst kept secret, however, as multiple leaks and confident speculation had unofficially announced the console's development in and around 1997, and these leaks concurred with what Sony wanted for the console. They wanted it, of course, to be able to play games with online play capabilities and with the ability to run and play CDs and DVDs. They envisioned it to be an entertainment hub for any home, and on March the 1st, 1999, they released that vision into the world. The PlayStation 2 had been announced, and there was one particular company that was watching rather closely. They saw the PlayStation's success, they saw the enhanced capabilities of its successor, and in it, they saw a threat, and they were so threatened that they felt the need to become major players in this console war. Little did they know just how involved they would get, and in their corner behind them, they had the corporate giant, the multi-billion-dollar technological empire of Microsoft. I am, of course, referring to the Xbox. Watching from the sidelines outside of the console gaming landscape sat a little company called Microsoft. Now, the company were no strangers to video games by all means. They had had tremendous success in the PC gaming world. However, console gaming had largely been seen by the company as an unnecessary field to enter into without a good reason for doing so. The PlayStation 2 was that reason. The console had been touted by Sony officials as being able to replace the PC in any given home environment. CEO of Microsoft Bill Gates himself didn't much like the prospect of his company being driven out of the ever-expanding gaming market by competitor Sony. Microsoft also had history with the Japanese company. They had previously attempted to make arrangements to work with Sony to develop programming software for the upcoming PS2. Their efforts ultimately fell short. Gates decided Microsoft finally needed to break into the world of console gaming. In 1998, 4 engineers from Microsoft's DirectX team began bouncing around ideas for a new console. These engineers consisted of Kevin Baker, Seamus Blackley, Ted Hayes, and team leader Otto Burks. The 4 wanted to create something special, a console that they intended to topple Sony's recent dominance over the gaming market with. The console would use existing PC hardware, Windows 2000, fitted and adapted for a tighter, slimmer console. This element would make the transition between developing games for the console and developing games for the PC easier for developers. Now, in response to this, there was some backlash from others under the Microsoft sphere of influence. Some wanted the console to be built from the ground up instead of repurposing the established PC technology. It was the idea from the 4 engineers, however, that was given the seal of approval by the head of Microsoft's gaming division, and when pitched to Mr. Gates himself, he approved of their idea also, citing the ease of implementing online access and how simple it would be to port PC games onto the console as reasons for him signing off on the project. The online play element referred to the designer's addition of an Ethernet port to the console. Ethernet ports would allow users to connect their console directly to their source of internet and would open up the option of playing on the same game but with those who are in different states or even different countries. Commonplace today, but back then this was incredibly revolutionary stuff for a console to have. But it was not to be all heaven in paradise, as the initial cheaper production costs the 4 had presented to Gates were grossly underestimated. They would need to make the console in-house rather than with a third party. This raised the overall price of production, and when the news reached Gates, he gathered almost everyone involved in the console's creation together for a meeting with him, on Valentine's Day no less, and gave them one of the most severe dressing downs I've ever heard of. Reluctantly though, Gates still signed off on the console's production due to the necessity that was competing with Sony. So they set off developing and designing, working for a good long while on the new console, and then they realized that they needed to settle on a name. A few names were flying around. One of the 4 engineers, Ted Hayes, jokingly referred to the console as the XX Xbox due to it supporting more graphic content than either of its competitors, Nintendo and Sony. But it would seem they had one rule for the naming. You see, X had to be in there. The team behind it, DirectX, were insistent on that, and just what stuck was the Direct Xbox. Through emails, this was shortened to the Xbox to save time, and from there I don't really know what to tell you. The name Xbox just continued to stick, so much so that it became the official name for the console. Development continued, and the console was announced by Gates himself at a conference in San Jose on March the 10th, 2000, using a prototype of the system. To a great reception, the crowd of developers loved the technological prowess the console displayed, along with the ingenious online play additions. It was all going rather well for Xbox, but they were still a while away from being able to release the thing onto the market, so they just kept working, with one cautious eye looking towards their Japanese counterparts across the Pacific Ocean, for the time was fast approaching for Sony to make their move. And make their move they did. On March the 4th, 2000, the PlayStation 2 was released, and Sony were rather busy raking in the sales. The momentum they had built up with their original console had snowballed into no end of hype for this new one, and this was reflected in the amount of money coming in within the first day of the console being on the market alone. The PlayStation 2 made $250 million within 24 hours, beating returning rival Sega with their new console, the Dreamcast, with a margin of $150 million between the two's first day holiday sale performances. It would be Sega's last major console to ever be released, and would be discontinued in 2001. The main reason for this being the PS2's popularity. Sony and the PlayStation 2 had pushed their only source of competition out of the picture. Now only the PS2 remained, and upon releasing in America and Europe later on in the year of 2000, and with no one to stop them, the sales came in thick and fast, and they would continue to, the PS2 remaining unchallenged in this generation of consoles for a whole 6 months. But a competitor was approaching, and not just one, but double that. Two were coming. The first of these major challengers to step into the ring was the old master of gaming, Nintendo, with their fourth major console, the Nintendo GameCube, releasing in September 2001 in Japan. Nintendo had been in this business for decades now, and so they were seen as the major competition for PS2, and ironically, Nintendo had created the beast that they now saw before them. In letting those negotiations with Sony deteriorate all those years ago, they had forged the path and lit the way for the PlayStation to enter the market they had once been dominant in for so long. But Nintendo came equipped to this fight with better hardware, more timeless franchises, and they even expanded their roster of classics to incorporate a few more, all first seen on the GameCube system. They had the history, the games, and the console. The stage had been set for a battle between the two powerhouses. The crowd chose their fighter to support and waited in anticipation. And then someone strange walked onto the battlefield, a third challenger, coming all the way from America. Yes, the Xbox had arrived. The team at Microsoft had been hard at work since the PS2's release, unveiling their first entry into the console market alongside Hollywood's everyman, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, in Viva Las Vegas no less. The American contingent had well and truly come into town, and on November 15th, 2001, the first original Xbox was released, first for their home country, the US of A. It was a triple threat as the three powerhouses fought it out. PlayStation 2 had the head start, it had the momentum. The company had invested in making popular games exclusive to their console, Grand Theft Auto and Metal Gear Solid among some of their more notable timed exclusives. The console was sleek, the marketing sleeker. Sony desperately wanted to fend off any potential challenger. Nintendo's GameCube had the history, the pedigree, the beloved well-established franchises. They also had the power. Their games looked better, they felt better, and despite the garish cube-like design of the console, they had remained a household name for 4 whole generations of consoles. And then there was Microsoft's Xbox, which had the best specifications out of the lot of them. This system came with no ends of power, online capabilities right out of the gate, and represented an easy bridge for PC players to cross to get into console gaming. Also in their corner was the best futuristic first-person shooter in the world, known as Halo, and it was all backed up by one of the biggest tech companies in the world. And looking at all this, you may be forgiven for thinking, wow, that's a pretty even matchup across the board. And on paper, it is. But a close fight between all three really doesn't reflect what happened next. Let's troll our way through those all-important sales numbers, folks. Okay, coming in at number 3 is the Nintendo GameCube with 21 million sales. A respectable effort, Nintendo. Coming up next at number 2 is the Xbox with 24 million sales. Pretty close there, guys. A well-fought contest. Number 1 can't be too far off that, sure. Yes, your eyes aren't deceiving you. 155 million total sales for the PlayStation 2. Minor spoilers for the rest of the video perhaps, but the PlayStation 2 sold so well. In fact, it is the best-selling home console of all time. If we combine the total sales of both its competitors, the Xbox and the GameCube, then Sony would still have sold 4 PlayStation 2s for every one console the pair of its rivals shifted out. Now this, at the time, was rather unexpected. On paper it should have been closer, but it wasn't. Why was that? Well, the PlayStation had used that 6-month to a year head start on the others to create new franchises, better games for the player base. At launch in 2000, the PS2 had a quotably laughable lineup of games. By the time their rivals' consoles' release dates rolled around, however, the PS2 boasted many revered and well-received titles, with more coming in the holiday period of 2001, and they had secured exclusive deals with certain third-party developers, thus closing the chapter on one of the console's main weaknesses and making it one of their biggest strengths. The elapsed time period gave game developers months to get used to the hardware, allowing them to figure out how to squeeze out every little bit of graphical potential the console could produce. Coupled with this, the marketing and advertising overhyped the console's technical capabilities with abstract adverts such as this. Also, at the time, DVDs were still one of the more accessible sources of media, therefore the PlayStation 2's use as a DVD player often tipped the scales in your average consumer's head. DVD players back then were still relatively expensive, and here was one included with something that would keep the kids happy. An additional draw came from the system being backwards compatible, so if you had mountains of original PlayStation games stacked up collecting dust, then you could now play them on the PlayStation 2 with no additional charge. And the major one in my opinion that attributes to most of those extra sales is the fact that it had such a long lifespan on the market. When the console released in early 2000, it would not stop being sold on shelves until 2013, a 12 to 13 year lifespan. The bottom line is, Sony and the PlayStation 2 were dominating the entire gaming market and staved off their competitors. Sega remained silent. Nintendo would never release a console with high-end graphics again, the GameCube being discontinued in 2007, and the Xbox would surely throw in the towel. Despite an albeit decent first outing into the console gaming world, the American company were outsold and outmatched in every major target market throughout the globe. They would soon fold and call off this whole gaming lark before fading into obscurity. Or so most people thought. It's 2003, and against all odds, Microsoft and Xbox would begin to prepare and draft designs for a successor to their original console. They held big, expansive events inviting hundreds of game developers vying for their support on this new console, and more importantly, they kept it under wraps. They had even secured a maker for the new console's processor, IBM, the same maker that were already working on a further project for PlayStation. Their team at IBM had to hide their work from PlayStation executives, such was the caution and control Xbox displayed here. Nevertheless, through cryptic marketing that captured the audience's attention, and a mouth-watering reveal at E3 2005, the new Xbox, dubbed the Xbox 360, was announced, with the system being released in November later that year to an enthusiastic American audience. And they were enthusiastic for the new features the Xbox 360 flaunted. You see, Microsoft had envisioned the 360 to be a device for all purposes: gaming, online gaming, videos, and music. It could all be experienced within the confines of this new system. The 360 had also pioneered the modern form of the gaming marketplace. There were multitudes of games, demos, and online services for their customers to enjoy. They even had a little camera for motion controls using your limbs and hands as the controller. This was called the Kinect. Remember this also, I'll talk about it a bit more later. And while the original Xbox had cut out a decent sales space for themselves in its home country, the US, the 360 achieved almost total dominance of the American market, despite the infamous red ring of death causing consoles to just up and break themselves whenever they felt like it. There were a few teething problems, but overall the Xbox 360 continued to dominate. How did it do so? Well, there are a few reasons. You see, mirroring the PlayStation 2 release, the Xbox 360 had no mainline competition for about a year. This granted similar advantages to them as it did the PS2, and as that console did, the 360 banked the sales with its quite incredibly cheap price point of $399, and they prepared their exclusives and third-party deals, getting the games ready to counter the arrival of its opposition into this era of gaming. And the Xbox was making some classics, holding some aces up their sleeves, ready to unveil onto the awaiting public at a moment's notice. Aces that distracted the consumer from the fact that they would now have to pay for the use of Xbox's online services. However, the Xbox had been thriving in this market for about a year with no competition in sight. But then, the same old competitors, wielding new weaponry, raised their heads above the trenches and made a headstrong charge into the market. These two were, of course, the Nintendo Wii and Sony's PlayStation 3. Let's deal with the former first. Okay, so, if we look past the rather humorous name, the Nintendo Wii represented the company taking a step back from being at the forefront of graphical potential with their consoles. Instead, the Wii's selling point came in the form of a gimmick: motion controls. Now, when I say gimmick, I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion, quite the opposite. Nintendo's Wii had the lowest price point out of all of the consoles in this generation when it was released in November for America and December for the rest of the world. And it had the worst graphics of the lot, but that didn't matter. The Wii sold incredibly well and for a time became the family's choice of consoles. Nintendo had doubled down on their now decades-old franchises and introduced incredibly entertaining party games games that your dad, your grandmother, and your dog could play. Unbelievably, the Nintendo, without relying heavily on online play and big blockbuster games, carved out a nice little niche in the gaming market. A niche that would allow Nintendo to see the console sell over 100 million units. Some feat. One that may require a video on its own. Nevertheless, although it was the most successful console of this generation, the Nintendo Wii showed that the company behind it wished to break away from this battle at the top of the gaming world. It was innovative, successful, inspired, but lacking in specific areas that would make it cutting edge. While Nintendo with its Wii had become a thorn in the 360's side, their main competitor was still yet to enter the fray. And off of the back of the best-selling console of all time, the PS2, Sony arrived on the scene with their new PlayStation 3, and with it came some outstanding features. The PS3 was better graphically than the 360, it had a built-in Blu-ray player, online play was supported from the off, it was the best console graphically and design-wise on the market bar none, and you could have this console in your hands for the cheap price of $599. I'm sorry, what was that? $599. Speak up. $599. Yes, the PS3 was a whopping $200 more than its American competition. The colossally high price point even became somewhat of an early meme. And as was the case with its predecessor, Sony didn't have many games to show off the console's capabilities. The launch lineup of games was again underwhelming, but this time they didn't have the head start on their fellow console makers. They were instead playing catch up, and they hadn't caught up. The PlayStation 3 had the more powerful processor, and that was great, but game developers hadn't yet got the hang of its rather difficult to adapt for cell technology. All the momentum they had acquired with their previous systems was lost, and it would be some time before they regained it. The delay, the price, and the tricky tech did not serve them well, and adding to this was the highly publicized period where the PlayStation's online service was hacked, leaving 77 million PlayStation customer accounts vulnerable and exposed. After this, the PlayStation's online services went offline for a mind-boggling 23 days, with players unable to play online for that amount of time. But getting through that, we come to the most damning figure, the sales. From January 2007, over a year since the Xbox 360's launch, and a couple of months after the PS3's launch, the former was still outselling the Japanese-made Titan by 50,000 units. This shows that Xbox had solidified and elevated their brand with timeless classic games, while PlayStation had rather tarnished theirs with gross misreading of what the public would pay for the PS3. Not even a free online service could save them. Sony had to change something, and within the first 7 months of release, the PS3's price would be slashed down by $100, slashed down the same amount again a further year and a few months into the future. They released different, slimmer models of the system coming out every year or so, with reduced prices and the higher amount of digital storage. Xbox retorted with a few different versions of their own console and price cuts coming along with them, but they ultimately didn't have to do much to stay competitive, show a few amazing games here and there, reiterate the low price point, and sit back and relax. But at PlayStation HQ, all hell had broken loose, and it was now go time. Executives worked day and night on marketing strategies. The exclusive game developers for the console got to grips with the hardware. They learned how to harness its potential to upgrade every element of their games. Slowly but surely, the PS3 clawed its way back up those sale charts, and with a few major hits releasing at the end of its run, they had finally overtaken the Xbox 360. The PS3 total sales amounting to 87.4 million, with the Xbox 360 only slightly lagging behind with 84 million. Wow, they had done it. They had come right back from the brink. The plucky underdog Sony had beaten the Xbox 360. Except that's not what these numbers and sales figures mean in the slightest. If we add a bit of context here, you may remember that the original Xbox sold 20 odd million units. Its successor, the 360, sold 84 million as discussed. That's a 60 million increase in total sales, and that is what's called a business success. The PlayStation 2, the original Xbox's competitor, sold 155 million. The PS3, 87 million. That's a decrease of just under 70 million. million. This is what's called a business failure. Sony had lost all of the advantage. The Xbox and indeed the Nintendo Wii had cut into their sales, allowing the latter to move beyond them and the former to almost equal them. Now, if Sony had knocked the PS3 out of the park, then there would be no console war to speak of, or at least not one of this magnitude. Instead, they had allowed a gap in the market, one of which the Xbox 360 now occupied. And as we headed into the 2010s, both systems and companies were now neck and neck in this console war. Round 1 went to the PS2, round 2 was a tie, and round 3 was just over the horizon. Would this one prove to be the decider? Yes, both companies, Microsoft and Sony, were hard at work designing the next generation of consoles, Sony having started development in 2008, with Microsoft beginning their own process in 2011. And in this, we see a trend. Sony tend to start production on their new systems quickly, almost immediately after the current one comes out, whereas Microsoft prefer a quick development cycle, getting the console out as soon as possible. There are merits and drawbacks to both methods, and neither is particularly better than the other. It's just a caveat, an interesting pattern that I've spotted between these two console makers. Anyhow, designs were drafted and production arrangements were made in both cases. Coming into this generation of consoles, the two creators were on near equal footing. Microsoft had established themselves as a real competitor to Sony's dominance in this space. Both factions of consoles still had devoted customers who were taking arms and offense at any comment, realistic or otherwise, that was seen as bashing their console of choice. They both had an equal amount of fans. So when rumours dropped that the new generation was coming, all who were on opposite sides began arguing in chat rooms, forums, comment sections, reviews of their games. This was a war, with the next battle set to take place in the following few years, and this time, this battle was sure to be a close call. In fact, nobody could call it. If you were a betting man, you simply wouldn't bet on who would win out here. A game of chicken broke out between the two, neither showing off much of their new systems until the very last second. PlayStation and Xbox were locked in a staring match, neither blinking. It was a little tense as an outsider, but then one budged. The Xbox. Xbox couldn't wait any longer. They decided to preemptively reveal their console in a separate Xbox presentation only a month before the big gaming event E3. The presentation kicked into life with a short, cute montage of workers and developers at and fans of Xbox telling us about the concept of the new system, with a few buzzwords and key terms like all-in-one, TV, alive fluttering about. Drop a few big names in there and you've got yourself the start of the show. How very Xbox. Now, alarm bells were already ringing in some, and they grew a little bit louder with the reveal of the new console's name, the Xbox One. This is where the first bit of ridicule followed. The internet reacted with confusion towards the new name. This was to be the third Xbox console. The last one was called the Xbox 360, so why was this system called the Xbox One? Matters were not helped when they revealed the console's design. Very blocky, very big, very chunky. Another dose of ridicule followed, and then the minutes continued on from there, executive after executive telling us about how the Xbox One would be an all-in-one entertainment system, with voice controls using the included Kinect camera for certain actions and connecting to your TV. It would be 30 long minutes into the hour-long presentation before they wheeled out the first bit of game footage, an EA Sports game. Now, this was a little tone deaf, as many people were excited to see something new and exclusive from Xbox. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people were interested in sports games, myself included, but a lot of people were disappointed that this would be their introduction into the new era of gaming. Then came Xbox's exclusive racing game Forza, followed by the equally exclusive, completely new title Quantum Break. Perhaps we are getting somewhere here. Nope, more corporate talk, then more promises of exclusives, and then more TV series spiel with another Steven Spielberg video cameo, followed by a lot more corporate talk, and then their ace in the hole, a title that would be again available to both consoles, the new Call of Duty. Most of the audience watching felt as if they were being pandered to. Xbox in total, in an hour-long conference, had shown the console, its ability to link to the TV, the most popular sports and shooter games, a racing game, a TV series, Steven Spielberg, and one new franchise with promises of more. Needless to say, to most people, it was very lackluster, and with the biggest gaming event just just around the corner unnecessary. Sony had done a similar presentation that was equally dull, but was streamed way earlier in the year and had contained some major reveals and some shocking partnerships, while keeping the new system dubbed the PS4 under wraps, saving it for the bigger occasion, and at least it was described to be a games console first, above all else. What Xbox showed here probably could have waited until E3 a month into the future, and even as a kid that played both FIFA and Call of Duty, I was bored, and if I sat you down to watch this conference with no context behind the Xbox, you may have thought it was just a box that you could use to watch your favourite TV shows, movies and sports on. Fans were also not happy with the absence of a price point. I just can't get over how unnecessary it all actually was. The presentation almost did unrepairable damage to the new console's reputation before it had even been released. And this was bad, but the worst was still yet to come. I hope you've remembered E3, the annual gaming trading event, as it was here in 2013 where the biggest, closest battle between the two companies would be won or lost. A bit of background behind the event perhaps. E3 started off in 1995 as a place where gaming companies could go to sell off their products to retailers through the use of a fancy presentation. Come 2013, while the event had retained that same goal, they had now focused a lot more on putting a show on for the fans, for potential customers. This show coming in the form of a conference, a presentation where major gaming companies announced their new systems, games and projects to the public. And E3 2013 was in place to be a big one, with both Sony and Microsoft set to reveal more about their brand new consoles within the space of a couple of days in their separate presentations. And being there at the time, watching it all develop in front of my watchful gaze, I can provide you the low-down eyewitness testimony as to what happened on those fateful days in summer of 2013. Little Joshua penned in those dates and times for each presentation and stayed up late to watch them both, popcorn and Monster Energy in hand. It would be Microsoft that stepped up to the plate first, and I was excited to see what they had in store, what those new Xbox One games would look like. This presentation was way better than the console reveal show. Looking back on it now, it isn't nearly as bad as I remembered it to be. Xbox came out with multiple new franchises that would be exclusive only to the Xbox One, and secured some heavy-hitting third parties to reveal their new games at the Xbox show. Retrospectively, it was actually a decent watch, so why did it go down so poorly with audiences back then? Well, behind the scenes, the team at Xbox were involved in some nefarious plots that were, unfortunately for them, leaked to the public. These plots included the controversial decision to permanently link one game to one particular account. This was referred to as Xbox's DRM policy. This means that if you were to buy a physical copy of the game on a disc, you could only play it using your one Xbox One with your only Xbox One account. This sparked a massive uproar in the fanbase, as this meant that used games could not be sold second-hand or shared between friends. A further baffling decision made by the Microsoft team was that the console would need you to authenticate the system using the online features every 24 hours. This decision, if carried out, would mean that customers in areas with no Wi-Fi support would be unable to access their new console. Now, word about both of these elements of the Xbox One spread around the internet like wildfire before the presentation, and would leave a majorly sour taste in the mouths of the audience in the conference room and those watching from home. So, although the presentation wasn't that bad, it was still doomed to fail. And then, during the presentation came the final straw for most, the price point. The Xbox One would be $499. They had repeated the same mistake the PlayStation 3 did. Just listen to the reaction of the crowd after that particular reveal at E3.
$499 in the US, and 499 euros in European markets, and 429 pounds in the UK.
The public consensus at this time was that the price was way too much for a system that, yes, boasted the most power, but would not perform that much differently in terms of graphical potential to its main competitor, the PS4. Now, the main reason for this high price was the inclusion of the Xbox Kinect, the camera I've mentioned before. Said camera allowed you to do multiple things, such as play Kinect supported games and control your menu and all that good stuff. But there was one major issue with the Kinect though. It was a decent bit of tech, but no one wanted it, and Xbox had put a lot of eggs into the Kinect basket, advertising it heavily, upgrading it from the previous model, and using it to justify the exorbitant price. But but they hadn't done quite enough to garner the public's anticipation for this feature's inclusion, and while Microsoft and Xbox, under a high amount of public pressure,
would turn their backs
on the one game, one account and the online authentication decisions merely a week after their E3 presentation, the damage had already been done. Xbox had seemingly shot themselves in the foot, missed their foot and shot their entire leg off, and yet the PlayStation event was still to come. All eyes turned to the Japanese console maker. How would they react to the Xbox's policies? At this point, awaiting the presentation, there was this awkward period of worry for most gaming enthusiasts out there. Xbox had made the first move. Would PlayStation follow suit? Would they enact their own ludicrous policies and raise the price of their console to match that of the Xbox? It was certainly a very real possibility that they would. However, the higher-ups at Sony, watching the Xbox One bomb at E3, saw an opportunity to stick the knife into Xbox, to come out of this generation as the good guys. So their presentation rolls around, the opening montage plays, and what came after was the heaviest beatdown I've ever seen in the gaming world. Sony, after opening with a little ad section for their handheld console, opened with trailers for game after game, all of them exclusive only to the PlayStation line of consoles. Then came the actual PS4 reveal. They showed the system, a sleek black trapezoid of a thing held by a man with tiny hands. They revealed the PS4's audio and video support. It only took 5 minutes. Then came more trailers of entirely exclusive games and popular third-party games. They got the sports involved, the MMOs, and then came the killer blows to the Xbox. They announced they wouldn't be imposing any of the same restrictions the Xbox One would have. PlayStation supports used games. PlayStation will not impose any online authentication. They didn't just gloss over those facts either. They dwelled on it, used valuable minutes to announce that they wouldn't be following the Xbox line of thinking. They had also convinced Bungie, a game developer who had been exclusive to Xbox, to give PlayStation some exclusive content for their highly anticipated game, Destiny. A minor drawback came when they announced that they would now start charging players for the use of their online services, bringing themselves in line with Xbox, but that was quickly forgotten upon the reveal of the new PS4's price. I'll let Andrew here do the talking and the crowd can handle the reaction.
I'm very proud to announce that PlayStation 4 will be available at $399.
Yes, $399. The PlayStation 4 had undercut the Xbox One entirely. PlayStation and Sony had plunged that knife into Xbox and Microsoft, and they just kept twisting it, with more and more content taking jabs at their competitor being released day after day. A further twist came in the form of the release dates. The PS4s would release a week before the Xbox One in North America on the 15th of November 2013, the Xbox One releasing on November 22nd the same year. At this point, the exclusives touted for both consoles were yet to be released, but when they were, the Xbox One exclusives performed decent to well with reviewers. However, PS4 exclusives performed well to near perfection with those same reviewers. And this is how it continued. While the Xbox One had some objectively great and fun games to play, and an arguably better online package, the PS4 had more objectively great games in comparison. Classics like God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, and The Last of Us Remastered paved the way for many more, and they would contribute to the console's overall sales figure reaching a total of 115 million. Now, the Xbox One had some classics also, Forza, Halo, Sunset Overdrive, and Dead Rising, but the console would still lag behind quite heavily, with a reported total of sales falling within the 50 to 55 million bracket. Looking at this then, it's safe to say the team at PlayStation had wrestled the momentum they had lost back off of the Xbox. The Xbox 360's title of the people's console, the consumer-friendly company, had been relinquished to both the PS4 and to PlayStation, and thus it continued into the next generation of games consoles for both of these companies, with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Now, these two had a more muted release due to the impact of coronavirus. There aren't many flashy presentations or comprehensive stats that I could show to you, viewer, apart from mentioning that Xbox, in an effort to catch up to the PlayStation, has introduced their game-changing service, the Xbox Game Pass. This practically hands out games new and old for a relatively cheap monthly charge. They've also still got the more powerful console in the Series X and are still lacking the games. However, with recent acquisitions of gaming studios, they can be seen to want to change that. The PS5 also has this issue with it having a relatively low amount of games, and they're still waiting on their established exclusives to make their return to the new console with new installments. PlayStation will be busy with searching for answers to Xbox's Game Pass, and recent news indicates that they are not just sitting back in their seats. PlayStation partnering up with popular social website Discord will see the effect of this in early 2022, and for now the early sales figures of both consoles puts the PS5 at 7.8 million sales and the Xbox Series X at 2.8 million, so still a big gap there. And that's it for now. Who knows what twists and turns we'll see during this console generation and beyond. Perhaps the console shortage will finally end and everyone will be able to get their hands on one of these new systems. Seriously, for most people the pair exist as myths. Maybe one day you'll be lucky enough to find one in the wilderness that is the online marketplace. Perhaps Xbox will slowly close that gap. Perhaps PlayStation will maintain their dominance. Perhaps a new challenger will enter the ring just as these two did all those years ago. I can't predict what's going to happen in the future with 100% surety, but what I do know for certain is that although one side may win battle after battle, and although challengers and kings may fall to the wayside, there will be no end to the console war.